everyone. Welcome into Power Hour. This is a special episode that's also cross-posting as Wide Right with Manny Navarro, and he is leading the conversation. I'm Nicole Auerbach, and we are breaking down what happened at the ACC spring meetings this week in Amelia Island. A lot of talk, a lot of rumors, and a lot of conversation about 7 schools that have explored whether or not the grant of rights is airtight and they might have opportunities to get out of the ACC. To close the meetings, ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips did address the league's future, and he said what he's been told is that we're all in this together emphatically. Manny and I break down what exactly we learned this week and where this is all going in college sports.
Because obviously it was a big week for the ACC. We've heard a lot about the Magnificent Seven and how they want to break apart from the ACC. And in the end, you've done a lot of reporting for us at The Athletic on the fact that nothing really is happening other than there might be a little bit more revenue sharing. I guess you cover the Big Ten. That's a conference that I think Miami is kind of hoping comes calling for them one day. Let's get your take just on the news and what happened in Amelia Island.
Yeah, so I think, we certainly saw a lot of attention there. Yeah. and a lot of, I think, anxiety spikes, right, when there's stuff out there and schools are specifically named. Mm-hmm. And, you had Whit Babcock, specifically, kind of confirmed the schools that were out there as those 7 in a conversation with David Teal from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And so we do know those are the schools. He also said that he feels like it was overblown as something that was organized, as kind of a voting block, which is also my read on the situation. Never heard anyone use that term Magnificent Seven, right? I think there are schools that have certainly had their lawyers looking at this. And I think Jim Phillips saying that that's not unusual or not raising an alarm bell is probably the right approach to this, because we've all wondered this for 2 years. Since the day Oklahoma and Texas went to the SEC, everyone's wondered, okay, how airtight is this grant of rights? And it's fascinating to me because, obviously we all talk about how the revenue gap is going to grow for the Big Ten, the SEC schools and the ACC schools. But also, if this grant of rights actually ends up keeping everyone in the league to 2036, then it actually also works, right? Yeah. Because it was supposed to be really airtight after Maryland left. And that's a very interesting dynamic about stability versus, that revenue gap. So I think ultimately, we're in a world now where people are grumbling. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be this underlying tension, especially for schools that believe that they could have opportunities in those 2 richest leagues. But we just don't know. I mean, it's still possible that someone ultimately does sue and challenge this grant of rights in court. Someone or someone's plural, right? That's why the 7 number is interesting. Not everyone would do it, but would multiple schools do it? We don't know exactly, where or how and how people feel about this. One source put it to me this way, that if this was a simple process, everyone would have already done it, right? They would have already challenge the grant of rights. So I think we're still in that same place that we know people are annoyed that they're not going to make as much money as their peers. And we know that certain schools believe that they're more valuable than others. Mm-hmm. And so we'll see about this adjustment to a revenue distribution model, where if you are Clemson and Florida State and you're thinking that you're carrying the league from a football standpoint, and you're having more success on the field and you get to eat what you kill a little bit more, the way that Gonzaga has in the WCC with their basketball tournament money, then I think, we'll see. I don't think it's necessarily going to stop anyone if they do get a phone call and they have an opportunity to go to the SEC or the Big Ten. But I think for now, you certainly threw your weight around a little bit and you're getting something, right? You're getting a little bit of an acknowledgement that people are bringing different things to this league or different value to this league. And it's a new revenue stream for the expanded playoff, right? So for that in particular, maybe people are going to feel okay with that it's more performance-based.
Yeah. Talking to the people at Miami, obviously I cover the Hurricanes quite a bit for us. They went to the Final Four. It was a huge year for them. Obviously, they're trying to build something with Mario Cristobal. It was a rough football season. But from a basketball standpoint and an athletic department standpoint, they feel good about the direction of the program as a whole. NIL's picked up. They've got a bunch of kids they've had under contract that have come to the University of Miami because of the NIL. So in a lot of ways, they hope to become that attractive program for the Big Ten or the SEC. From a Miami perspective, I personally feel that the best conference for them is the Big Ten, especially from an academic standpoint. I know you brought up the AAU.
Just for if people aren't aware, because this was something that I think Big 12 fans were learning about. It's like the classification for it's like an academic. What is the initials? We should have looked this up.
We should have looked it up beforehand, but it's okay.
But it's a collection of schools that are, committed to whatever levels of, research universities. So the Big Ten has only ever brought in AAU schools. Right now, Nebraska is not an AAU member. It lost that accreditation, but it was when they got added. So USC and UCLA are both AAU schools. And that is very important to the university presidents in this league, like that level of academic prestige. So that when you're associating these schools with each other, and also maybe there's research and things that go across campuses, but just that is something that's very important. I know fans are always like, when we kind of play this game and you're divvying up schools and which one makes more sense where. But that could definitely be a factor for any potential Big Ten expansion.
Yeah, and I think from Miami, the academic standards, obviously being in the ACC, being a member there, it matters to them as well.
Yeah.
Because I know Miami fans watching this are saying, well, we think we'd fit better in the SEC where we're located and all that kind of stuff. But when you start trying to project down the road, right, like what might happen and what might eventually lead to future expansion. First of all, you've already mentioned the TV contract. It runs through 2036. We had this conversation off air. What makes sense to me is the next time we may actually reach a conversation that makes sense for any of this movement to take place is 2030, which is when the Big Ten's contract has to be renewed.
Yep.
At which point, in my opinion, they have to be motivated. I mean, they're already at 16 teams with UCLA and USC. For the SEC, does it make sense at all? No, it really doesn't to me, right? They've got the Southeast lockdown. They've got all the best teams. So to me, it's almost as if, for Miami anyway, it's sort of Big Ten or bust if they're going to get into a new conference. Do you agree with that? What's sort of your opinion on, what makes the most sense?
So I think in general, the timing that you're thinking does make a lot of sense as we look for inflection points. I mean, obviously everyone's still keeping tabs on the Big 12 and the Pac-12 dynamics, because until the Pac-12 signs a media deal and a grant of rights and stabilizes, we're going to have that conversation on a regular basis, because we know the Big 12 wants to be aggressive. So again, when you're looking, does the Pac-12 stabilize and kind of stay together and then sign a shorter-ish term deal? Well, then things might be fine for a few years here. I mean, again, if someone sues the ACC or challenges this grant of right and breaks open a whole new set of schools for people that are suddenly available that are not available right now, then it's a different conversation. Right. But we have seen a lot of this movement, the big ones in these recent years, right ahead of the media deal. So that makes sense, right? Because you're going to market and you're saying this is what we have. This is where we bring value in our inventory and rivalries and how this works. So I do think there is a very good chance that, the Pac-12 stabilizes itself, stays whole as a Pac-12, and then signs a relatively short-term deal, grant of rights, and then we kind of have these conversations in a couple years when the Big Ten is doing their media deal again. The SEC's deal is also going to come up again before the
2032,
ACC.
I think, right?
Yeah. Well, that would be around the negotiating time, but I think it's 2024 to 34, if I'm remembering right, 10-year deal. But that's where things are going to get dicey and uncomfortable, because we already know those leagues are going to bring in a lot more money than the ACC by the end of the decade, but then they're going to negotiate again and that number will go up again. So that's where the angst will grow.
Right. Yeah, and I think, for the Miami fans and the other ACC fans who are hoping to see movement or sort of have their fingers crossed that something might come of these meetings in Amelia Island, again, you just have to think about this logically. Nobody's going to pay those exit fees right now, right?
I'm not even sure what the number would be. We don't know, right? Because, to get your own rights to be able to broadcast a home game, that's what's tied in the grant of rights. Right. So we could say it's $120 million exit fee, but then what would it cost to actually get the rights to your own games again, the media rights? That's the question. So it's very complicated to not know what the dollar figure is, and then to also feel like, I'm sure Miami fans feel, that 2036 is really far away.
The whole point of why I'm bringing up the whole 2030 is the exit fee will be obviously less financially. I mean,
yes,
just do
closer
the math.
To the end of the deal.
Closer to the end of the deal. And then also you're going to have a motivating factor on the other side, right? Because just because Clemson and Florida State want out doesn't mean they've got anybody wanting to take them right now.
Right. So this is someone put it to me like this, like a chicken and the egg situation, right? So like they would want to get out of the ACC to get to another league, but then to get to the other league, they would need to know that they could get out of the ACC.
Right.
So if you don't know either thing and you can't really do this, how does that work? Which one comes first? And, there's so much money at stake in the way that these processes work. Who calls who first? How, whatever, right? There's a reason these things were very clandestine and like kind of jumped out and got dumped on the college football world. So I think that's part of this. And then also, like you mentioned, I mean, these are two leagues that aren't even at 16 yet. Is that going to work for them? Right. Or are they going to say, it does make more sense to go to 20 or whatever it is and structure ourselves differently? I think another concern about if you're, paying attention from the Big Ten or the SEC standpoint is, what size is too big? First of all, it could just be a little bit unwieldy, but also at some point there will be a size where you're going to attract a lot of lawsuits like the NCAA is from like a collusion antitrust issue. And depends who you talk to. Like, is 20 that number where suddenly you're going to be that subject and there's a bullseye on your back? So these are all factors that are going to play into whether or not these leagues continue to expand. And then also for, let's say in the ACC, part of the reason that like this would be a major, like, it would just break open another round of realignment if the ACC schools were available, is because both of those leagues would be interested in some of the same schools.
Yes.
So right now there's no pressure point. Like if we know Oregon and Washington would want to go to the Big Ten, but the Big Ten and their media partners don't see enough value there, there's nothing saying like, well, you have to do it now because otherwise the SEC is going to scoop us up. But with the ACC schools, you could see one of these leagues getting into a point where they go, well, no, we need to make a move so that this school doesn't go to the SEC or that this school doesn't go to the Big Ten. That's another pressure point that could happen at some point.
So realistically, as we kind of try to summarize some of this up, as much as we may be talking about, ACC teams being unhappy, unless the Big Ten or the SEC wants them to begin with, and B has a reason to add them.
Yes.
I mean, it's all kind of silly, right? I mean, this.
That's what realignment is, though. I mean, we always end up having these conversations about things that could never happen, or could. We just don't know. But yeah, these are all, and especially like, this is something I think of too, because the math to expand and to add different members in the past, like let's say about Rutgers and Maryland or whatever, right? Like. You were doing it for different reasons because you were getting into certain markets and like getting part of the cable package for Big Ten Network. But also like the number that you had to hit to bring in a school to say like you're at least worth this per year was lower. Now the number is really high. Like it has to be, there's not many schools that actually would like pay for themselves, right? So it does have to be other reasons like, are you like, okay, well we've got, New Jersey, Maryland, we want to go Virginia, North Carolina. Do you want to get into Florida for recruiting reasons and for footprint reasons or, population reasons, right? And more people moving down south. Like you have to calculate all of that and your media partners need to decide that whatever it is valuable enough. So that's why it's really hard to project these things.
Yeah, and I would say too, the other mitigating factor in this, right, is the TVs, the cable networks, right? Like ESPN, for them, it makes perfect sense having the SEC, the quote unquote number one league, right, and then keeping the ACC together as is, because that's maybe. When you think of beyond the Power Two, that's the next best league, right? You could certainly make that argument.
Well, and if you think about it that way too, I mean, they also, part of the reason that we have this angst, right, is because they're like, well, we're not getting paid that much. It's a long-term deal, 20-year deal. Well, that's a great deal for the ACC then.
Right, for ESPN.
For ESPN. Yeah, because if we're saying, if the ACC schools are like, no, we're worth more, well, then why would ESPN change how much they're paying out when they don't have to? They agreed to a contract and it's a good deal for them because of the inventory that they get and the brands that they get. There's no reason that they would need to volunteer to pay more.
Right. Which to me is why ultimately the key to this all is whether or not the Big Ten wants to do more. Wants to do this, wants to expand. Because in all reality, let's just assume for a second that college football stays status quo, which is Georgia, Alabama, and the teams in the South win the national championship probably 7 out of every 8 years, right? Every now and then we may get a Michigan or Ohio State that breaks through. Well, what could potentially push the Big Ten to want to expand, right? They've already got a great TV deal. I think it would be adding a team in the South who could help them beat.
I mean, that could be a compelling reason, right? Like, or combined with other reasons, right? I think that's why, like, it's so hard to know. And I think that's also why, like, when you look at Florida State and Miami, they're in that group of 7, right? Like these are both schools that are interested in seeing what else is out there and believe that they could be worth more or could be in a league that is more financially secure and are worried that they'll both fall behind if they're making $30 million less per year over year. And that would build on itself. So I think that's a valid point. I hadn't thought about that one, but I think that coupled with, again, like the way the population is shifting in the country, these could be reasons that end up factoring in. And we also just don't know, a couple years from now, what the next main thing is, right? Like we talk about value, brand value, like can you get people to pay for a streaming package for games? Like the Big Ten's going to have these games on Peacock or basketball games on Peacock. But again, like the last 10 years ago, it was...
We never saw this coming, right?
Yeah, no, and it was like, markets. Like, we got to be in this city or we got to be in the... So it's like the main priority has changed in different rounds of realignment too. But I do think, back to your point about positioning yourself behind the Big Ten and the SEC, I think a lot of people are jockeying for that spot right now. I mean, when you think about like the Big 12 and the confidence that they project, their interest again in continuing to expand or potentially thinking they can get Pac-12 schools, which we don't know if that's going to happen yet. They're trying to position themselves to be the third strongest. And so I thought that was another interesting thing that came out of the meetings in Amelia Island was Jim Phillips and also Michael Alford at FSU, like specifically saying like we bring in the third most amount of money and like we know that there's a gap and we need to close it and look for new revenue streams and look at these things, but like we don't want to drop below that. Like we're still in a better position essentially than these other 2 leagues.
A lot of times you kind of got to cut your losses, right? And say, well, it's better than being the 4th or 5th best conference.
Right. So it's very interesting, and especially for a league that, you're wrestling between your identity as basketball historically with football, investment, the fact that like of those 7 schools, North Carolina's there, but not Duke, right? Like imagining a world without those 2 in the same conference. So there's so many different interesting wrinkles here. And so I guess I'm not surprised that this all kind of boiled over, became public this way. And it sounded like people had some really hard conversations.
Yeah. Nicole, thanks for coming on and chatting with me. I know it's a very busy time. We're here in Chicago having our athletic meetings, but thanks for the time and explaining it to our ACC fans, exactly your perspective and providing your insights.
Yeah, anytime. And that will do it for this episode of Power Hour and Wide Right with Nicole Auerbach and Manny Navarro. We'll see you next time.